Some warnings don't come with words, they come with instinct. The voice might have said if anyone had been listening closely enough that morning, but no one was, not at first. Not until the sound cut through the terminal like something alive, sharp and sudden, a bark that didn't belong in a place filled with rolling suitcases and tired travelers. Rex had never sounded like that before. Not in crowds, not in noise, not in chaos. And yet there he was, standing rigid on the polished floor of Terminal B, his amber eyes locked on a single point across the moving sea of people. Daniel Hayes felt the shift before he understood it. The way the air tightens just before something changes, his hand tightened slightly on the leash. Not pulling, not restraining, just listening, because Rex wasn't just any dog. He was trained to notice what humans miss, the faint, the hidden, the almost invisible signals beneath the surface of ordinary life. And right now, he was telling him something was wrong. 30 feet ahead, near gate 27, a woman stood with a baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket. She looked like any other traveler, tired, quiet, rocking gently from foot to foot as if counting seconds instead of minutes. But Rex stepped forward again, low growl, now threading beneath his breath. Not aggressive, not wild, but focused, precise, the kind of sound that came from recognition, not fear. Daniel exhaled slowly, scanning the scene. Nothing obvious, no alarms, no shouting, just the steady hum of announcements overhead and the distant rumble of planes taxiing outside. "Easy, boy," he murmured, but Rex didn't ease. His ears stayed high, his body angled forward, every muscle tuned like a wire pulled tight. A few nearby travelers began to notice, their conversations fading as they glanced over, curiosity turning into discomfort. Phones slowly lifting, someone whispering. Security casting a longer look than before. The woman shifted, clutching the baby a little closer, her eyes flicking toward the dog, then away. Too quickly, Daniel saw that, the hesitation, the flicker of something that didn't match the calm she was trying to wear. Rex took another step, then stopped completely still. Now, as if he had reached the exact point he needed to be, his gaze fixed not on the woman, but on the bundle in her arms. His breathing slowed, then changed, shorter, sharper, and then, without warning, he let out one single bark, louder than the rest, echoing against the high ceiling. And in that instant, the entire terminal seemed to pause, like the world itself had missed a beat. Daniel felt in his chest that quiet, undeniable certainty. This wasn't random. This wasn't a mistake. This was a signal, and whatever Rex was sensing, it was already happening. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that came before it, like the air itself was waiting for someone to understand what had just happened. Daniel did not move right away, his eyes fixed on Rex, because in all the years they had worked together, this was the exact moment that mattered most. Not the bark, not the attention, but what came after. Rex lowered his head slightly, his posture shifting from alert to something more deliberate, more precise, his tail still, his ears forward, and then slowly, carefully, he stepped closer to the woman, each movement measured, controlled, like he was navigating something fragile. "Sir, you need to step back," a security officer called out, voice firm but uncertain. Daniel raised one hand slightly without looking away, not in defiance, but in quiet request. Just a second more, because Rex had not finished. And when Rex had not finished, it meant something was still unfolding. The woman's breathing had changed, shallow now, uneven, her grip tightening around the baby, as if holding on could fix something she did not fully understand. "He is making people uncomfortable," another voice added from somewhere behind. But the words felt distant, unimportant compared to the quiet rhythm Daniel was trying to read. Rex reached the edge of her space and stopped, his nose lifting slightly, drawing in the air, then lowering again toward the baby. Not touching yet, just hovering, listening in the way only he could. Daniel's mind moved quickly, recalling patterns, training, moments in the field when everything looked normal until it was not. Rex's breathing matched something, a rhythm, or maybe the absence of one. And then the dog did something Daniel had only seen a handful of times before. He sat down, directly in front of the woman, blocking her path without aggression, without force, just presence, a quiet refusal to let the moment pass unnoticed. "Ma'am, Is everything all right? The first officer asked, softer now, closer. The woman nodded too quickly, her eyes darting. Yes, he is just a dog. He is confused. But her voice trembled at the edges, and Daniel heard it. The small fracture beneath the surface. Rex let out a low, almost inaudible whine, the kind that never meant danger, only urgency. And then he leaned forward and gently pressed his nose against the baby's blanket. Once, then again, lingering this time, as if waiting for something that was not answering back. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from recognition. The baby, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. And suddenly the woman's composure cracked just slightly, just enough for truth to slip through. Her eyes dropped to the child in her arms. Her rocking stopped. And for the first time, she looked not at the crowd, not at the dog, but at the baby itself. Really looked as if seeing something she had been too afraid to notice before. The officer stepped closer, concern replacing authority. "Ma'am, can you check on your baby?" he asked gently. And in that fragile pause, where everything slowed down to a single breath, Rex remained, perfectly still, watching, waiting, as if he had known all along that this moment would come, and that someone just needed to see it. The woman's hands began to tremble as she slowly pulled the blanket back just enough to see her baby's face. And for a moment, nothing happened, no cry, no small movement, no soft sound that should have been there, only a stillness that felt too quiet for a place like this. Daniel took one careful step closer, his voice steady but low. "Ma'am, is your baby breathing?" The question hung in the air like something fragile, and the woman's lips parted, but no answer came. Her eyes searching, confused, as if she had been moving on instinct for so long that she had forgotten. To check, truly check, the officer beside her leaned in, concern deepening. "Let me take a look," he said gently, but Rex shifted slightly, not blocking, not resisting, just staying close, his gaze fixed, unwavering. Daniel watched the dog's chest rise and fall, then looked at the baby again, trying to match the rhythm, but something did not align. The tiny chest beneath the blanket was too still, too quiet, and in that instant, Daniel understood what Rex had been trying to say from the very beginning. This was not about danger, not about threat. It was about something missing, something fading. "Ma'am," Daniel said again, softer now, "may I?" She hesitated just for a second, then nodded, her grip loosening as if she no longer trusted her own hands. Daniel stepped forward and gently placed 2 fingers near the baby's chest, careful, precise, listening the way he had learned long ago, not with panic, but with focus. The world around them seemed to blur, the announcements overhead fading into the background, the rolling suitcases, the murmurs, the distant engines, all of it distant now, because in that small space between breaths, everything mattered. Rex let out a quiet whine, almost like an echo of urgency. And then, just as Daniel adjusted his position, there was a faint, uneven, a shallow movement, so subtle it could have been missed entirely. But it was there, fragile, inconsistent, like a signal struggling to be heard. "He is breathing," Daniel said quickly, looking up, "but it is not steady." The officer immediately spoke into his radio, his tone changing from control to urgency, calling for medical assistance. The woman's eyes filled with tears, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet overflow of something she had been holding back. "I thought he was just sleeping," she whispered, her voice breaking at the edges. Daniel nodded gently, not correcting, not judging, because sometimes the difference between sleep and something else was too small to see. Without help, Rex remained right where he was, sitting beside them, his body finally relaxing just slightly, as if the message had been delivered, but his eyes never left the baby, still watching, still listening, making sure that this time someone else was paying attention too. And as the distant sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, cutting through the terminal once again, Daniel realized that without that single bark, without that moment of interruption, this quiet, fragile signal might have passed unnoticed entirely. The sound of hurried footsteps grew clearer as 2 medical responders pushed through the crowd, their presence parting the tension like a quiet wave. One of them kneeling immediately beside Daniel, while the other gently guided the woman to sit down on a nearby bench, her hands still shaking, Her eyes locked on her baby, as if afraid to look away again. Daniel shifted slightly to give space, but he did not step back completely. His focus still anchored to that faint, uneven rhythm. "What have we got?" One of the responders asked, calm but direct, irregular breathing. Daniel replied, steady, precise, the kind of tone that came from years of knowing that clarity mattered more than panic. The responder nodded and carefully placed a small monitor against the baby's chest, watching, listening, measuring something invisible to everyone else. Rex remained seated at Daniel's side, his body no longer tense, but not relaxed either, as if he understood that the moment was not over yet. Only. Changing, the woman leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is he going to be okay?" The responder glanced up briefly, offering a soft, reassuring look. "We're going to help him," he said, not promising, not guessing, just present, just steady, the kind of answer that holds a person together when certainty is still far away. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the weight in his chest shift, not gone, but lighter, because now the responsibility was shared. The crowd that had once felt restless now stood quiet, phones lowered, conversations forgotten, replaced by something more human, more aware. Rex turned his head slightly, watching the responders, then the baby, then Daniel, his ears flicking with each small sound, as if still tracking the invisible thread that had brought them here. The second responder adjusted the blanket carefully, making sure the baby was comfortable, supported, breathing just a little easier than before, and for the first time, a small movement came, subtle but real, a tiny shift beneath the fabric, almost like a response to being seen. The woman gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth, tears slipping freely now, not from fear alone, but from the release of it. Daniel noticed Rex's posture change again, just slightly, the rigid line of his back easing, his breathing deepening, as if the message he had carried was finally being received fully, completely. The first responder nodded to his partner, then looked at Daniel. "You caught that early," he said quietly, not making a scene, just acknowledging what had happened. Daniel shook his head once, his gaze drifting down to Rex. "He did," he replied, simple, honest, because that was the truth. It had always been the truth. The responder followed his lot for a brief moment, then gave a small nod of understanding, the kind that did not need words, as the medical team prepared to move the woman and her baby toward further care. The terminal slowly began to breathe again, the sounds returning, softer at first, then building. But something had changed, something subtle and lasting, because in a place built for movement, for departures and arrivals, a single moment of stillness had revealed something most people would have walked past without ever knowing. And Rex, now calm but still watching, seemed to understand that sometimes the most important things in the world are the ones that make no noise at all until someone listens closely enough. The stretcher rolled forward slowly, guided with care through the wide corridor of the terminal, and the world seemed to part for it in a quiet, respectful way, as if everyone understood that something fragile was being carried through the middle of their ordinary day. Daniel walked a few steps behind, not following out of obligation, but because something in him was not ready to let go of the moment just yet. Rex stayed close at his side, his gait calm now, steady, his earlier urgency replaced by a quiet watchfulness that had not fully faded. The woman sat beside the responders, her hand resting gently on her baby's chest, as if learning a rhythm she had almost missed, her eyes no longer searching the crowd, but focused inward, present in a way she had not been before. One of the responders spoke softly to her, explaining, guiding, offering small reassurances that built a bridge between fear and understanding. Daniel slowed his steps as they reached the edge of the secured area, where only authorized personnel could continue. And for a moment, he simply stood there, watching as the doors opened and then closed again, separating this moment from the rest of the world. Rex sat beside him without being asked, his eyes still on the door, his ears relaxed but attentive, as if confirming that the story he had sensed had reached its next chapter. Daniel let out a long breath he had not realized he had been holding, his hand resting briefly on Rex's head, fingers brushing through the thick fur in a quiet gesture of gratitude. Not spoken, not needed, just understood behind them. The terminal began to return to its rhythm. Announcements resumed. Footsteps filled the space again. Conversations picked up where they had been interrupted, but something had shifted beneath it all, something subtle that lingered in the way people glanced a little longer, listened a little more closely. A security officer approached Daniel, his earlier firmness replaced with something quieter, more respectful. "Sir," he said, pausing for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. "Your dog." He noticed that before anyone else. Daniel nodded once, his gaze still soft. "He listens differently," he replied, and the officer gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if that answer carried more meaning than it first appeared. A woman from the crowd stepped forward hesitantly, her phone lowered now, her expression no longer curious but sincere. "I thought he was just causing trouble," she admitted softly. "I was wrong." Daniel offered a faint smile, not correcting her, not holding anything against her, because moments like this were not about being right or wrong. They were about seeing something new. Rex turned his head slightly toward the sound of her voice, his tail giving a small, slow wag, not seeking attention, just acknowledging presence, as if he understood that people, like moments, could change when given the chance. Daniel glanced down at him again, then back toward the closed doors, his thoughts settling into something quiet and steady, because in a place built for departures, something had arrived instead, something that could not be packed into a suitcase or scheduled on a boarding pass. A reminder that sometimes the smallest signals carry the greatest meaning. And as Rex finally stood, ready to move on, his calm steps echoing softly against the polished floor, Daniel followed, knowing that whatever came next, he would keep listening, just like the one beside him always had. The terminal lights softened as evening began to settle outside the tall glass windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor. And for the first time since the moment had unfolded, Daniel allowed himself to sit down on a quiet row of seats near the far end of the gate, Rex lying beside him, his head resting calmly on his paws. Those eyes remained half open, always aware, always present. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the runway where planes moved slowly, like distant shadows, each one carrying people to places unknown, each one part of a rhythm that never truly stopped. And yet his thoughts stayed anchored to what had just happened. Not the noise, not the attention, but the quiet realization of how close something had come to being missed. A soft chime echoed overhead as another boarding announcement began, but it felt distant, like a reminder that the world continues whether or not we are ready for it. Rex shifted slightly, lifting his head, and glancing toward the secured doors again, as if checking once more that everything remained as it should be. Daniel noticed the movement and gave a faint nod, a silent acknowledgement between them, because there were moments when words did not carry the weight that understanding did. A man seated a few rows away glanced over, then hesitated before speaking. "That was something back there," he said quietly, not intruding, just sharing the space. Daniel gave a small nod in return. "Yeah," he replied simply, because anything more felt unnecessary. The man looked at Rex, then back at Daniel. How did he know? The question lingered, not demanding an answer, but searching for one. Daniel rested his hand gently on Rex's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "He listens to things we forget to hear," he said after a moment, his voice calm, certain, the kind of certainty that comes from experience rather than explanation. The man sat back slowly, absorbing that, as if it was not just about the dog, but about something larger, something quieter. Time passed in small, unnoticed ways, footsteps, distant voices, the low hum of engines outside, and then, almost without warning, the same doors that had closed earlier opened again, drawing Daniel's attention back. A medical responder stepped out, scanning the area briefly before spotting him, their eyes meeting with recognition. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, but the responder gave a small, reassuring nod, the kind that carries meaning without detail. Daniel felt the tension in his chest ease just a little more, not fully gone but settled, grounded. Rex stood slowly, his ears lifting, his body aligning with that subtle shift in the air, as if he understood that something important had just been confirmed. Daniel rose as well, not rushing, not needing to ask questions that would be answered in time. because sometimes, knowing that something had changed was enough, he glanced down. At Rex again, a quiet gratitude passing between them once more. And as they turned toward their gate, blending back into the steady flow of travelers, the moment did not disappear. It stayed, carried forward in a way that could not be seen, only felt, a reminder that even in places built for noise and motion, there are still signals worth listening for, if only someone is willing to hear them. The boarding call for Daniel's flight echoed softly through the terminal, a calm voice inviting passengers to line up in an orderly sequence. But he did not move right away, not because he was distracted, but because something inside him was still settling, like the last ripple of a wave that had not quite reached the shore. Rex stood beside him, his posture relaxed now, yet attentive in that quiet, constant way that had always defined him. Daniel glanced down at his watch out of habit, then back toward the gate, measuring time the way he had learned years ago, not in minutes, but in moments that mattered. The line began to form, travelers stepping forward with tickets in hand, conversations resuming in low tones, the ordinary rhythm returning once more. And yet, as Daniel stepped into place, he noticed something different in the way people moved around him, slower, more aware, a few glances directed toward Rex, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to respect, a quiet acknowledgement that passed without words. A woman holding a small child gave a gentle nod as she walked by, her eyes soft, grateful in a way that suggested she had seen more than just an interruption earlier. Daniel returned the nod slightly, not making it larger than it needed to be, because some exchanges were meant to remain simple. Rex shifted his weight subtly, his gaze drifting across the space, not searching for danger, but observing, as if confirming that everything had returned to balance. The line moved forward, step by step, until Daniel reached the scanner, the soft beep of approval sounding almost insignificant compared to what had unfolded before. The attendant smiled briefly, her expression warmer than routine. "Have a good flight," she said, and Daniel nodded once, stepping through. The transition from terminal to jet bridge felt like crossing an invisible threshold, the air cooler, quieter, the outside world fading behind him. As he walked down the narrow corridor, the sound of his footsteps echoed faintly, steady, measured, Rex's pause making almost no sound at all. And for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to feel the weight of everything that had happened, not as something heavy, but as something meaningful, something that would stay with him long after this flight, long after this day. The cabin greeted them with soft lighting and the familiar hum of preparation, passengers finding their seats, overhead bins opening and closing, a quiet choreography that played out on every flight. Daniel guided Rex to his place near the window, settling in with a practiced ease, the dog lying down immediately, his body fitting perfectly into the space as if he had done this 100 times before. Daniel looked out through the small oval window, the runway lights stretching into the distance like a path drawn across the darkening evening. And as the plane prepared to move, he felt a sense of stillness settle within him. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from understanding, because earlier, in the middle of noise and motion, something had spoken without words, and someone had listened, and sometimes that is all it takes to change everything. The plane began to move with a slow, steady roll, the soft hum of the engines building beneath the cabin floor as the runway lights stretched in a long golden lines outside the window, and Daniel rested his head back slightly, his eyes half closed, not asleep, just listening, because even here, even above the ground, he had learned that there were always signals if you paid attention closely enough. Rex lay at his feet, still and calm, his breathing even now, no longer carrying the urgency from before. But something in his posture suggested that he had not forgotten, that he never truly forgot. A flight attendant passed quietly down the aisle, checking seat belts, offering small smiles, the routine unfolding exactly as expected. And yet Daniel felt a subtle shift inside him. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet awareness that moments like the one at the terminal did not end when the doors closed. They stayed, echoing in small ways, shaping how you saw the world afterward. The plane lifted gently into the air, the ground falling away in a smooth, almost silent motion. And as the city lights spread out below like scattered stars, Daniel opened his eyes and looked out, his reflection faint against the glass. Layered over the moving lights beneath, he thought about the woman, about the way her expression had changed when she truly saw her child, about the responder's quiet nod, about the way the crowd had shifted from noise to stillness. And he wondered how many moments, like that passed unnoticed every day, how many signals were missed because no one was trained or willing or patient enough to see them. Rex stirred slightly, lifting his head just enough to glance up at him, their eyes meeting for a brief second, and Daniel gave a small nod, the kind that needed no explanation because whatever had happened earlier, it had not been coincidence, it had been connection, something deeper than routine or training alone, something that lived in instinct, in awareness, in the quiet bond between a man and a dog who had learned to trust each other without question. A soft chime sounded overhead as the seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers around them began to shift, reaching for bags, adjusting positions, returning to their own worlds. But Daniel remained still for a moment longer, letting the silence settle, because there was something else, something he could not quite name yet, a feeling that this was not the end of the story, that the moment at the airport had only opened something, revealed something that was still unfolding somewhere beyond his view. The thought lingered as he finally reached down and rested his hand gently on Rex's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. And as the plane continued forward into the darkening sky, Daniel realized that sometimes the most important stories do not end when the moment passes. They continue quietly, in places you may never see, carried forward by the lives they touched, waiting for someone, somewhere, to notice what happens next. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane settled into its cruising altitude, a soft glow replacing the sharper brightness from earlier, and the steady hum of the engines became something almost comforting, like a quiet reminder that everything was moving forward exactly as it should. Daniel remained by the window, his gaze drifting between the darkness outside and the faint reflection of himself in the glass. A man shaped by years of listening to things others overlooked, and beside him, Rex rested in that same quiet awareness, his body still, his presence constant, as if even now he was tuned to something deeper than the surface of the moment. Time passed in gentle increments, minutes folding into each other without urgency, until a subtle movement in the aisle caught Daniel's attention. A flight attendant approaching with a small, folded note in her hand, her expression calm but slightly different, as if she carried something more than routine. She paused beside him and spoke softly. "Sir, this was sent up from the ground before we departed." Daniel accepted the note with a quiet nod, his fingers unfolding it carefully. The paper, light but carrying a weight he could not yet name. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, but clear enough to read. "He is stable now. They said we got there just in time. Thank you for listening when I could not. I did not even realize something was wrong until your dog would not stop. I'll never forget this." Daniel read the words once, then again, slower this time, letting them settle, not as praise, not as something to hold on to, but as confirmation of something he had already known, that the moment had mattered, that it had changed something real. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching him with quiet attention, and Daniel lowered his hand, letting the paper rest loosely between his fingers. "You hear that, boy?" he said softly, not expecting a response, just sharing the space. Rex's ears flicked once, his eyes steady, as if understanding was not something that needed to be spoken aloud. Daniel leaned back again, his gaze returning to the window, the endless stretch of darkness, beyond broken only by distant lights far below. And for a long moment he simply breathed, steady, grounded, aware in a way that did not demand anything more. Because sometimes the outcome was not about recognition or reward. It was about knowing that something fragile had been seen in time, that a quiet signal had not gone unheard. The note remained in his hand, a small, simple piece of paper carrying a story that would continue long after this flight landed, long after the noise of the terminal faded into memory. And as the plane moved steadily through the night, Daniel realized that what Rex had done was not extraordinary to him. It was simply who he was, a reminder that there are still ways of understanding the world that do not rely on words, that do not need explanation, only attention. And somewhere far below, in a place they would never return to, a life continued because someone had listened when it mattered most. And in the quiet space between one breath and the next, Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment, not in sleep, but in quiet acknowledgement, because sometimes the world does not need more noise. It only needs someone willing to hear what has always been there.